You may have heard that there's some lawsuits on the rise about websites not being accessible. And so I want to talk about why we're seeing more of these lawsuits and a few solutions that you can take into account.
Welcome to the Media Books Podcast, the only place on the internet where creative accounting isn't a bad thing. Owning a virtual firm today means having a professional and modern online presence, and in this podcast, we talk about how to do just that. My name is Kristen Corey, and I'm the owner of Media Books, a media agency that provides creativity exclusively to accounting firms. And if you're an accounting firm owner, you're in the right place. Let's get into it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Media Books Podcast. In this podcast episode, I'm going to be talking about website accessibility, and specifically, you may have heard that there's some lawsuits on the rise about websites not being accessible, about your bookkeeping or accounting firm websites not being accessible. And so I want to talk about why we're seeing more of these lawsuits and a few solutions that you can take into account. Real quick though, this is my last podcast episode before I head out on my maternity leave. So I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break over the summer, but I had to get this podcast episode out just because I've seen so many questions and comments about it. I had just a client just a couple weeks ago, my last client actually before I wrapped up for my maternity leave. This was a big concern of hers. And so it was something that I was kind of aware of, digging into a little bit, and I wanted to bring my market research to you guys. When I first started Media Books, I heard some great advice, and it was that for every critique or feedback that you get, you don't necessarily need to write it down. You're going to get plenty of sort of one-off tips or things that people think that you should change. The ones that you should really listen to, though, are going to be the ones that were reoccurring. And this is one of those things where I have seen questions come up time and time again over just like the last month, where at first, I had someone in like a Facebook group ask about it, and I was like, oh, I don't know if that's too much of an issue, or maybe they just saw an article, or it was like a spam article or a clickbait article. I didn't think too much of it. And then a couple days later, someone else, a client brought it up. And so I started to dig into it more. And shortly after I was kind of digging into, what's with this uptick, I came across a company that sort of answered all my questions. And so I'm going to talk about the education of why you may be seeing an uptick in lawsuits around website accessibility. And then I'm also going to talk about what it means to have an accessible website and what you can make sure to do on your end with your website to make sure that you are compliant. Okay, so what has changed? Why is there all of a sudden an uptick in website owners being sued for their website not being accessible? And when I say accessible, I'm referring to people that are blind who may not be able to navigate your website, people that have disabilities with their motor skills, and maybe they have to use a keyboard and they can't use a mouse to navigate your websites. That's essentially what I mean when I say accessible. Is it accessible to people with disabilities? And in 1990, there was the Americans with Disabilities Act. And essentially what that was it made sure that those with disabilities had the same rights as everyone else. The internet wasn't really around or as prevalent as it is now, back when this act was originally written. So there wasn't a lot of consideration for businesses that operate heavily online. However, in March of 2022, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, has since been updated to include business websites. So just like public businesses need to have their their storefront accessible by wheelchair, you need to make sure your website is accessible by people with different abilities. So that is kind of why we're starting to see an uptick. This is a very recent thing where now websites are being considered, whether they are accessible or not. So now it's kind of the follow-up question of, okay, well then what does it mean to have an accessible website? They came up, but essentially the people that have updated the Americans with Disabilities Act have written the Website Content Accessibility Guidelines, so the WCAG. And this is a report of over 1,000 pages. There's a lot of information in it, but the bullet points that I've been able to kind of understand from this is that it needs to have things like alternative text on images. So for people that cannot see and they want to be able to understand what images are on the website, it needs to be an alternative text to explain what the images are. Color contrast. So for people that don't have great vision, there needs to be a high level of contrast between the text and the background, so it's visible. Same thing with text resizing. So people that, again, have issues with sight and different seeing abilities, they need to be able to have the text visible, a reasonably visible, a good size. It can't be too small and possibly may need to be adjusted. So after reviewing kind of some of these requirements and starting to get an understand of what is included in a lot of these guidelines, frankly, I mean, a lot of these just seem like good web design principles to follow. Having high contrast between your background and your text is a good web design principle to follow. Text on images also is good for your SEO. That's one thing that communicates to Google. So a lot of these things you may already very well be practicing, even unintentionally. But there are some guidelines that are more abstract. For example, one thing is that when you click on a button on a website, and let's say that button leads to a new tab, there needs to be an indication that a new tab is opening. So it's some of those things that are a little bit more not as obvious to people who aren't experiencing this specific disability that need to understand that or need to know this information. We don't necessarily think about. And so that's why there's a little bit of a gray area around making sure your website is fully compliant if this is something you had never considered before. So there's a couple things I want to talk about now as far as solutions that you can consider when wanting to make sure your website is compliant. The primary source that I have been referring to is actually a really awesome company called Accessibility. And their primary goal is to help business owners with websites make sure that their website is compliant. Now, I came across a webinar that they did just to kind of start my education on this subject. And since I have watched the webinar, I have since partnered with them. And every step along the way, I have been thoroughly impressed by what they have put together. The webinar answered a lot of my questions, and through their partnering program, understanding their tech, everything seems very well done, very well thought through. The tech that they've been using seems fantastic. I haven't experienced any glitches. I'm very much a fan of how they've been able to help me as a web designer who is very, very much in the beginning stages of understanding these new rules. They've been a big help. So I wanted to first give a shout out to them. Having said that, they have 2 tools that are helpful to not just web designers, but are made for really every sort of website owner. And the first tool is a website audit tool. And essentially, if you've ever used like Google Page Speed Insights or SEMrush, a lot of the tools that I've talked about, any tool where it kind of audits your website, this is a very similar tool where all you have to do is put in your URL and it will read your website to make sure it meets all these accessibility standards. So it will note issues with graphics, readability, clickable, so things like buttons and links. It'll check titles, forms, menus, and it has a very detailed report that it'll give you. It'll give you an overall score and it'll tell you whether you are compliant. This is a free tool. So I highly recommend at least just running your website through this tool to understand where you are standing wise. But this is kind of a great starting option. Another tool that Accessibility has is a widget tool. And this is something that is so insanely easy to install into your website. I was going to start like geeking out about the branding features, but it's a marketing feature. The more important feature is really that essentially what this widget is that people can click on the tool and it customizes your website to fit the accessibility needs of someone visiting your website. So the tool itself will alter your website for people who are visually impaired, who have cognitive disabilities. those who use a keyboard to navigate websites, or, those who are blind, you can toggle on a switch and it'll easily do that to your website. The tool has to be turned on. So this is not like you add this to your website and then your website's all altered and every single person that visits your website, sees these specific features or this redesign. So it's specifically, you have to go and activate this tool. But if you go to our website, mediabooksagency.com, you can actually see we have this tool installed on our website now. And so it's a blue icon on the bottom right. There's like a little person. And if you click on it, you can see how the widget works. And you can toggle on all these different features and see how our website accommodates those with different needs. Another side benefit of using this tool is if you are sued or if someone does try to come after you and your website for not being accessible, they have a package of content explaining the tools and all the steps you've taken by integrating this tool and how it should accommodate the new guidelines, the WCAG guidelines that came out. And so it feels like they've really thought of everything. The branding that I talked about just a few minutes ago, when you install the tool, it is literally a copy and paste, one line of code. If you've ever embedded a form on a website, it's the exact same thing. And when you embed this form, they also give you the option of changing like the icon logo and the color of the logo of the little icon, so that you can make sure even when it's on your website, it's branded and it's not distracting necessarily to just the everyday user of your website. So it can blend in very easily, but still make sure it's accessible to people that need it. I'm a big fan of it so far. And I feel like it's definitely something at least worth considering if you wanted to go a little bit beyond just the website audit tool that they already have on their Access2B website. And so I have links in the show notes linking to the audit tool. I also have a link to the widget where you can purchase that. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is some of the benefits of incorporating this onto your website. And some are obvious. I became aware of this issue because there was a lot of buzz within the accounting community about accounting firm owners possibly getting sued because of their website not being accessible. And so this is one of the benefits, is that it could help prevent that. But Access2B also mentions that this can help with things like website SEO and overall the user experience, which I agree. There certainly appears like there can be some benefits there. So that's just something to consider when you consider the user experience of visiting your website. At MediaBooks, we believe in offering an exceptional user experience for all website visitors. That's why partnering with Access2B, the market leader in web accessibility, is a step towards empowering our customers and opening up the digital world to everyone. Access2B provides users with website and audit tools and applications that ensure your website is accessible for visitors of all capabilities. To learn more about integrating Access2B into your website, visit the link in our show notes. Something else that I felt like I had to mention to this particular audience is the American Disability Act credit can also be applied here. It provides you a 50% credit to your payment towards the widget tool on your website. And so I have a link in the show notes further explaining the tax credit and how it applies specifically to this Access2B tool. Really great kind of little additional benefit there that you can kind of deduce whether financially this is going to be right for you. Last thing I want to end you with is a few closing thoughts. I totally understand that this can be the possibility of being sued, can be a concern for firms of all sizes, but there are just a few simple steps that you can really take to make sure your website is meeting these requirements. And I really hate any sort of marketing where it's like, do this or you'll get sued. The chances of your website or your business being sued for this, like being audited by the IRS, are probably low, but there is a free solution that can help just give you that extra level of protection. And so that's what I really kind of want to focus on, is that yes, there are apps that you have to pay for that, can help provide a very high level of security. But this is something that you can just spend an afternoon making sure your website is meeting these requirements and make you feel a little bit more confident when these stories do pop up. It's a free website tool, free website audit tool. So start there. If you are interested in the widget, we can also provide you with a 10% discount on Accessibility to your website if that is something you're interested in. So I have all that information, again, linked in our show notes. If you do have any questions, I really value that we can be a source of calm and information when it comes to any sort of concern around your website. So please reach out to us, hello@mediabooksagency.com, and I will see you guys in a couple months. When it comes to designing websites, the service page always takes much more time than anticipated. It can sometimes be hard to verbalize everything you do, so I always recommend simplifying, which is what I'm going to do right now with MediaBooks. Here at MediaBooks, we offer 3 services for every stage of your business. We offer web design for when you are just getting your marketing strategy up and running, or you need a website refresh. We offer website audit services for those DIYers, and we also have advisory services for those who love their website and are ready to advance their marketing skills. Get started with MediaBooks by visiting mediabooksagency.com. MediaBooks, the only place on the internet where creative accounting isn't a bad thing.